to open really by talking about what I mean by looking at addiction and addiction recovery through the spiritual lens. I'm so blessed to be here at Foundations as the spiritual care counselor. And I recognize one of the things I love about Foundations is we are holistic integrated treatment. And that's something that we have on our business card, but it's also something that we live. And I often ask myself, what does that actually mean? Because those words sound great, right? Holistic and integrated. To me, what that means is a recognition that there's always 4 aspects to life. The Buddhists call it the 4 rooms: spiritual, mental, emotional, and physical. And while I recognize that, of course, there's a physical, a mental, and emotional aspect to addiction and addiction recovery, I feel very blessed that I get to look at addiction and addiction recovery through this spiritual lens. And so what do I mean when I say looking at addiction through the spiritual lens? Because people will often come to me and the natural conversation starts to be a conversation about higher power. And although that can be an aspect of spirituality, what I actually mean by spirituality, and I'm going to tell a little bit of my personal story, which I think has definitely influenced this viewpoint, if you will, of the world. What I mean by this is that connection, as Rosemary so beautifully talked about, that connection with the essential self. My experience in working in this field for many years, I've been in this field off and on for 25 years, but actually full-time in this field for about 7 or 8 years. My experience is that all of our patients have some separation from that essential self in some way. So I want to tell a little bit of my story because I think it is relevant in terms of this perspective, this viewpoint of a way to look at addiction through the spiritual lens and how we can assist our patients with that in breaking free of these destructive patterns, because that's really why people come to our programs and our practices, right? They want to be free. So I was born a very, very, very happy being. My mother loves telling the story about how I was the happiest child she'd ever met. I always laughed, I always giggled, I was so present. I actually remember being in awe of the world. I remember laying in my backyard in Indiana in the summer and just watching a ladybug for hours. I don't know if it was hours. It felt like hours. It might have been for 5 minutes, but in a little kid's world, that's hours, right? And really just fascinated and in awe of the world. Something happened at age 7, and I shut down. Now, I don't know everything that was happening in my outer realm that caused this shutting down, but I do remember the experience like it was yesterday. I remember being at the dining room table, and my mother and sister were in the room, my mother and both my sisters, and I remember a physical sensation of closing off. It was as if I was putting a wall around my heart in order to protect something that felt too vulnerable. Now, what I know was happening, a few things that were happening, is my parents were in a marriage that neither one of them wanted to be in, and I think they were together for the kids. I often have said, I want to be a poster child for the please don't stay together for the kids, right? Because they were modeling this relationship that was anything but loving. My mother it was a product of the 1950s, and all she knew was being a mother and a housewife, and she didn't want that. She used to love telling us, I wish I wasn't a mother. I wish I didn't have kids. My dad, on the other hand, was very busy with women that were not my mother. So there was a lot going on in my household that wasn't being spoken. So what was being said and what I was feeling and experiencing were completely incongruent. And that in some way caused some sort of separation from the essential self. So from age 7 until age 13, when I discovered drugs and alcohol, I was absolutely miserable. I had lost that curiosity, I had lost that awe, I had lost any optimism. I felt completely closed off and separated. So I actually am so grateful for drugs and alcohol because they saved my life. They allowed that psychic pain to have some momentary relief. The problem, or the issue, as we all know, is I wanted them to keep working that way. And so it was more and more and more and more. And I'm not going to go into my whole story, but finally by the age of 20, I got sober. It sounds like so old, right? Finally by the age of 20. So I was very blessed to get sober fairly young, 50 some odd days before my 21st birthday, ironically. And that began my journey. So the reason I tell that story is that when I came into working in this field, I began to notice that a lot of the modalities of treatment were focused on symptoms and behavior. I worked in residential treatment, and really the intention, and rightfully so, was to stabilize a patient and get them into the long-term care they needed. And that worked, and it does work for the majority of the patients that come through and came through our programs. But I started noticing this repetition of clients. The same patients were coming back to us over and over and over again for treatment. And there was sort of this focus of like, what's going to be different this time? It was almost as if we were kind of putting that on the client. What's going to be different this time? And at one point I thought, yeah, that is the question. But what if that's a mirror for us as the clinicians to ask ourselves, what are we going to do differently this time? And so in my experience, my second book is going to be recovery focused, and in my experience looking at addiction through the spiritual lens, and again I recognize there's a physical, a mental, and an emotional aspect, but looking through the spiritual lens, I've come to understand that there are 3 root causes that drive the addictive behavior, in particular with the chronic relapsers. And that is toxic shame, unresolved trauma, and spiritual disconnection. And I think one of the things that we do in this field, and again, rightfully so, is maybe we're a little afraid to go too deep into the trauma because we have been for such a short amount of time. But my question for us is, what about those chronic relapsers that keep coming back to our programs over and over and over again? And how are we going to get down to helping them have a safe container, whether that's us or a partnership with someone that does maybe trauma work, someone that works with toxic shame, and what can we do while we have these patients in our care to assist them in breaking free from these patterns? And what I guess I want to kind of focus on a little bit in the last few minutes is the toxic shame, because that's what came up and that's what came through so clearly when you were speaking, Rosemary, that what I've come to understand and experience with our patients, bless you, is that there is a sense of brokenness, right? And I think 20 years ago, one of the ways we treated addiction, we just looked at the behavior. And as a matter of fact, there's some modalities of treatment out there that want the person to look at kind of what's wrong here and what do I need to correct. The thing is, guilt is I've done something wrong. Shame is there's something wrong with me, right? We all know that. The work of John Bradshaw opened my eyes to that in the 1980s. And of course, we have Brené Brown now that is just a preeminent researcher in shame. So this conversation is coming to the forefront in so many of our circles. When it's guilt, I've done something wrong, I go make amends and I correct that and I'm better, right? Things get better. But when I'm holding a belief that I'm broken, there's something wrong with me, and I go to make the amend and then I ask, why do I feel worse? So what I've come to recognize in working with our patients is that there is this sense of brokenness that they're carrying around, and most of them don't even know that they're doing it. As a matter of fact, in working with patients here, I will often hear our clients saying, but if I don't think there's something wrong with me, I'm never going to get better. Because there's some sort of messaging that if they continue to be hard on themselves, somehow they're going to do the work they need. And yet, of course, certainly through the spiritual lens, the exact opposite is true. And so as Carl Jung says, if it's living in the unconscious, it's running our life and we call it fate. It's only when we bring it into conscious awareness that we can recognize we're choosing. And that last part was me, not Carl Jung. So assisting our patients in recognizing that inner dialogue that many of them don't even know are happening is often a very important first step, because it's a doorway into them recognizing that inner dialogue. And as Rosemary so beautifully said, then it becomes about self-parenting, right? There was that wonderful little book called Self-Parenting in the 1980s. I have no idea what's in there because I haven't read it in those 30 years or 25 years, but it changed my life because I didn't know I was walking around brutalizing myself. I had an incredibly hypercritical mother. Nothing was ever right. And so I walked around feeling like I was in a minefield and everything I did was wrong. But I didn't know that I had grown up. And all I did was internalize those messages, and I was talking to myself that same way. So it wasn't until I had a space for that to come forward that I could recognize that that was influencing my life. And if I believe that about myself, of course I want to get high. Of course I want to use. Now that might be overly simplistic in what addiction is and how we treat it. And again, that's why I speak about the 4 rooms, because this is one way we can assist our patients in recognizing how that inner dialogue affects and impacts what they call reality, and a way for them to break free from that is that's holding a space for them to be able to see themselves in a beautiful way.